Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Our second session. What I want to do today is different in the sense that whenever there are classes, or colloquia, or symposia that focus on Panama, the centerpiece of the narrative is always the canal. And I've been asked, how can you possibly teach anything on Panama or impart any knowledge about Panama without considering the canal or foreshadowing the canal? Well, that's my goal today. What I want to do is to consider the colonial period and the earliest period after separation from Spain up to the opening of the Panama Railroad. And here's why. I always think that it's important to give the efficacy of what you are approaching. I always do it in my undergraduate classes because otherwise I won't have any kind of rapt interest. It's always, why are we doing this? So I'll tell you why. Despite the fact that Panama was an erstwhile colony of the United States for a long period, fact of the matter is that Panama today has been more indelibly shaped by its Spanish colonial past than anything else. When there were coups, when there were military takeovers in Panama, many looked at astonishment and said, how could this be? A representative constitutional state with a strong U.S. presence, it seems impossible that that could happen here. And my answer is that some 300 plus years of Spanish authoritarian hierarchical rule put in place various governing structures that didn't dissipate, and they remain here today. That's why democracy in Panama is still so fragile. And while it takes considerable vigilance in order to see that Panama remain a representative, constitutional, governing state, a republic. So, I want to look at some overarching themes that place Panama at the center. In our last session, I mentioned that Panama is a window into so many things. And one of the things Panama helps us to understand is the nature of Spanish imperialism, the nature of both the administrative structures and the mercantilist system, how the commerce that passed through Panama enabled Spain to project its power around the globe. And so, let me begin. What I want to do is work both extemporaneously, but I also have some prepared notes that will allow me to actually finish where I want to finish and to also open up the floor to questions. But what I want to do first is, since we've already had our first session and you had an opportunity to digest the broad overview, I'd like to entertain now any kinds of questions or anything that you want me to clarify from last week before I get into a more specific and honed period in Panama's history. Is there anything that you want me to address as an addendum from our first session? I'd be happy to do that now, or I could do it if something suggests itself, leave some time aside, 10 minutes or so at the end, to do that. But is there anything pressing that you'd want me to respond to? Yes?
This question, I'm sure you'll answer as we go forward, but was the Panama Canal completed while Teddy Roosevelt was in office, or was it after he left office?
It was after he left office. In fact, it was under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson that the canal opened. Even at that point, though, Teddy Roosevelt took full credit, of course, for this phenomenal engineering feat. And it really was through his sheer will and perseverance that it was completed on time and under cost. But it opens in 1914 in August, just as World War I begins, and President Woodrow Wilson is the one who hits the ceremonial switch that allows the full functioning of the canal and really sets up the dam that holds back the Chagres River and enables the canal to actually operate properly. Anything else? All right. Well, let me move us forward and address the following. So, Panama, long before the arrival of the Europeans, was a crossroads as well for Native American peoples. And as we move into the 20th century, one of the episodes that I want to highlight is an interesting story about the Kuna people who create, in a unilateral fashion, their own independent state within Panama. And it's in the comarca of San Blas. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to visit that portion of Panama, but it's a fascinating story, as is much of Panamanian history, that involves intrigue, backroom dealings, and the United States, or at least a few elements within it, helped to back this creation of an autonomous Native American entity within the Republic of Panama itself. And the Kuna still have a special status within Panama. So I'll address more about the indigenous peoples when we get to that, because it would be a time where I could move it forward, the narrative, into the present. So what is the present situation for Native Americans within Panama itself? But in Panama, this isthmus, there were various Native American groups, none of which had hierarchical, strongly centralized, complex systems in the way that you see in Mesoamerica amongst the Mexica or the Aztecs, or in the Andes amongst the Inca. These are far more decentralized, diffuse. The population estimates at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million. But that's always subject to reinterpretation, particularly since history and anthropology are all about interrogating the past and coming up with new strategies to figure out in a more exact way answers to those questions. So there are a few things that I wanted to reference in regard to this pre-Columbian period. So as I said, estimates vary greatly for the number of Native Americans who inhabited the isthmus when the Spanish arrived. By some accounts, the population was considerably greater than that of contemporary Panama today. As I said, some Panamanian historians have suggested there may have been a population of upwards 750,000 to 1 million. Three of the most important groups were the Kuna, which constituted by far the largest group, and two other major groups, the Guayamí and the Chocó. They have been identified by ethnologists as the most significant groups at the time of the European arrival in the early 16th century. As I said, the Kuna are now found mostly in the comarca of San Blas. It is an indigenous territory. Some Panamanians refer to it as a reserve. It's considered part of the Colón province for official purposes. Many have categorized the Kuna as belonging to Caribbean culture, though their origins still are subject to speculation. Among all three of these indigenous groups, land was communally owned and farmed. In addition to hunting and fishing, the Native Americans raised corn, cotton, cacao, various root crops and other vegetables and fruits. They lived then, as many still do, in circular thatched huts and slept in hammocks. Villages specialized in producing certain goods, and traders moved among them along the roads and coastal waterways in dugout canoes. These Native Americans were skillful potters, stone cutters, goldsmiths, and silversmiths. The ornaments that they wore, including the breastplates and earrings of beaten gold, reinforced the Spanish myth of El Dorado and the search for gold here in the Isthmus. Now, I want to do, I guess, something that in ways is a little unorthodox. But when we talk about the arrival of the Spanish in the Americas, it doesn't begin in 1492. It actually begins more than 7 centuries earlier, in a period known as the Reconquista, the Reconquest of Iberia. It was a 780-plus year struggle between shifting alliances of Christians in Iberia, what is now Spain and Portugal, versus shifting alliances of various Muslim groups. The original struggle was over resources: land, access to water, struggle for control over domesticated animals that were there. But by the middle part to latter stages of the 11th century, around 1085, if we want to get specific, this struggle becomes infused with religion and religious fervor. Most people, when they think of the Crusades, always place their consideration on the Holy Lands, the taking back of the Holy Lands from an expansionist Muslim power. But the reality is the first crusade of sorts was in Iberia, taking back the territory south of the Pyrenees in a long, intermittent struggle. And it ends precisely in 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella, referenced as the Catholic kings, married in 1469, they were on the front lines in Granada when Islamic forces surrendered, and all of Iberia then was under the dominance of the kingdoms of Castile, which is where Isabella was from, and Aragon, the kingdom of Ferdinand. I would argue that it is this long period of heightened militarism, the Spaniards, we'll call them, learning how to take territory, how to absorb it, how to divide the spoils of war, how to create towns. All of those things were invaluable to them because it was the exact template that they would use in the Americas. The notion that the Spaniards arrived in the Americas and that they acted in an ad hoc fashion, that they were unclear as to how to carry out the subjugation of Native American peoples or how to create administrative structures is completely false. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had had nearly 8 centuries of practice. And prior to coming to places like Panama, They also were able to hone their skills in islands just off of Iberia itself, places like the Canary Islands. So that when Columbus, in his various voyages, 4 in total, arrives in the Americas, it was no accident, and the Spanish were poised to exploit the opportunity in ways that no other European peoples would have been able to do. It is a result of this Reconquista. Further, the very tools of subjugation, the technologies that the Spanish employed, had come to Iberia via the Muslims. That long period of Muslim interaction provided Spain and Portugal with a very rich cultural heritage. It gave them technologies, the caravel to sail across the Atlantic, the compass and the astrolabe. These weren't things that were developed organically by the Iberian peoples. They were brought there by the Muslims. And so there's often the question, why is it that the Iberians, the Portuguese and Spanish, are the first to expand outward from Europe and to begin to take portions of the world, the Portuguese in Africa, the Portuguese in the Indian subcontinent, places like Goa, the Portuguese in Asia, and the Spanish in particular in the Americas. Spain would also take territories in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, named for King Philip II. But I really believe that it is this right here that puts us at the moment of encounter. And so this is a map of Iberia, and it shows the progressive stages of these, as I call them, shifting alliances. There were times that in this feudal structure, recalcitrant Christian vassals would turn their backs on their lords and side with the Muslims in the fight in an opportunistic way against their overlords. There were Muslims who were in line to govern their caliphates and who were overlooked in the line of succession. They would turn their backs and side with the Christian forces. But for the most part, it is this long-term struggle. You see the parts in darkest purple. These are the areas that were earliest taken back by the Christians. There would be one foray of the Muslim forces across the Pyrenees Mountains into France, the famous Battle of Tours in 732. This Muslim raiding party was defeated by Charles Martel and others, and then never again would any of the raiding parties cross over the Pyrenees into what was Frankish territory. But you see right there in the middle, where the darker color ends, there's a strict border. That's the city of Toledo. And in 1085, the fall of Toledo in part is what triggers a vigorous response. The Islamic world begins to send in fighters from North Africa into the southern reaches of Iberia. The Pope calls for an erstwhile crusade, so warrior monks from all over Europe arrive, and this is when the struggle becomes infused with religious fervor. It would take another 4 centuries for the Christian forces to finally capture this southern area of Andalusia, in particular Granada. Granada will fall, as I said, in 1492, the very same year that Spain expands across the Atlantic with Christopher Columbus's first voyage. Not a coincidence. What Spain does in places like the Isthmus, Panama, our focus, as far as conversion's concerned, is tied to a true belief that there was divine sanction, that God was on the Christian side, and that's why they prevailed. Throughout the struggle against the Muslims, Christian forces called upon Santiago, St. James. And the call to St. James during this time was Santiago Matamoros, Santiago, killer of Muslims. The reference to Santiago will continue when the Spaniards arrive in the Americas, but he then becomes Santiago Mata Indios, killer of Indians. It is transferable. You see here one of the famous paintings showing Ferdinand and Isabella receiving the terms of surrender in 1492. Christopher Columbus turned to all of the major monarchs seeking support and was denied by all until he was given financial support by the Catholic kings, as they referenced themselves, Ferdinand and Isabella. The deal, though, was he would be given titles, such as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He would have the opportunity to enrich himself. But all land and all resources from the land would belong to the sovereigns of Spain. And that would remain in place throughout the entire colonial period. This whole process of conquest and settlement was based on the idea that these territories belonged to the Spanish crown, not to the Spanish people. The crown would give licenses, the crown would give special permissions, but in the end, the crown could at any time and for basically any reason expropriate those lands and those resources in the Americas. Columbus would be the second person from Europe to touch upon what is now Panama. And that would happen during his fourth voyage. And so he never realized just how close he was to that South Sea, which would have taken him to the destinations in Asia that he sought. But he did travel all along the Caribbean coast of Panama in his final voyage. This encounter really changes the world, not because it allows for conquest and colonization, though that's part of it. Another key element is that this sustained encounter between Old World and New brings about what Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange, named for Columbus. It is the exchange of plants and animals and peoples and technologies and ideas and diseases which would change the world forever. It would affect the way people ate. It would affect the nature of work and crop production. And so what I want to show you here is just anytime you see history broken down into vectors and basic schemata, be a little suspicious. It's an oversimplification. But there is this. And so the Old World had at its disposal domesticated animals, cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, goats. None of those existed in the so-called New World. None. In the Old World, you had various grains, such as wheat and rice, barley, and oats that allowed for a more stable, sustained type of agriculture. The domesticated animals provided muscle power, they provided leather, they provided manure, they allowed people to move quickly and control their land. And so these were tremendous advantages that the peoples of the Old World, the Europeans and the Spaniards, who were at the vanguard of this conquest, that they had. Also coming from the Old World were diseases that would absolutely decimate Native American populations. These are diseases such as measles and smallpox. More than anything else, far greater than Spanish exploitation, far greater than Spanish cruelty. In the deaths of Native Americans, places like the Caribbean saw a 95% population loss because of smallpox and measles. And so the question was asked, why were these diseases from the Old World so lethal in the New? And in part, it's explained because those diseases had come into the human chain through close interaction with domesticated animals. And so the peoples of the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, had these recurring epidemics, and over time, with each epidemic, although they were lethal and terrible, there were always those who survived, and they passed on their resistance to their progeny. But in the Americas, those diseases didn't exist because those domestic animals weren't there. And so in the Americas, we see parts of the Caribbean completely denuded of their Native American populations. In fact, the Spaniards early on would begin to take Native Americans from places like Panama and bring them to the Caribbean in order to provide labor and tribute. That very quickly was ended. And in part, it was ended because of a serious debate back in Spain. How should Native Americans be considered in this whole colonial enterprise? Are they there simply to be exploited, or are they true subjects of the crown with rights? And I'll talk about how that debate plays out. Coming from the Americas, though, there were things that reconfigured the way people ate in parts of the Old World. You see things like the potato, like cassava. You see things like the sweet potato. You know, those were native to the Americas, didn't exist in Europe or elsewhere. And then you look fast forward to the history of a place like Ireland. What would Irish history be without the potato famine? They became so reliant upon this tuberous fiber that when the crop failed in the 1840s, it led to widespread death and destruction and the mass exiting of the Irish to places like the United States. We see as well peppers and other items that would be a key component in cuisines in places as far away as Asia. And so this is, again, in a more simplified form, Alfred Crosby's Columbian Exchange, an exchange that begins with the first sustained, continual interchange. Again, not saying that the first time that there is exchange between Old World and New is 1492, but it's the first sustained exchange. And this, in part, is what it leads to. Okay. Panama will be ground zero for this Columbian exchange. It will be the crossroads for the movement of Old and New World items back and forth. And that would begin at the very outset, the very beginning of the 1500s. So far, so good? All right.
Were there diseases that came from the Americas back to Europe?
It's almost as if I were soliciting that question. All right.
What is the question?
Yes, the question is, was it simply all of the most pernicious diseases coming from the old world to the new? Were there diseases in the new world that caused death and destruction in the old? Alfred Crosby initially argued that the one disease that had its base in the New World and that then spread to the old was syphilis, venereal diseases. And of course, as they became more intractable and deadly, you see references to it in different places. So in Spain, looking through archival materials, and I see reference to the French contagion. I'm like, syphilis. The French, meanwhile, claimed that it was the Spanish disease. So there's a lot of finger pointing here. Subsequent work has shown that there existed syphilis in the Old World, in Asia and elsewhere, they know for sure, prior to this exchange. But it was of a different strain, a different sort. And so there really wasn't anything that was completely new that came from the Americas to the rest of the world that created the same kind of death toll that measles and smallpox caused in the Americas. But I think what happened, and I've been told this, I don't know if it's true or not, but when Alfred Crosby was putting this theory together in his Columbian Exchange, I think someone raised the question, wow, that vector coming from the Old World, there's some good things, grains and domesticated animals, but there are a lot of bad things flowing all one way. And it made him think, well, I've got to find some things that are going the other way. And so what he said off the top of his head was, well, what about syphilis and what about tobacco? You know, that's kind of ahistorical. You know, we know now that tobacco has all these health effects. They certainly didn't know that then. And to kind of use that as the America's revenge on the rest of the world, I think is a little bit problematic.
Did yellow fever and malaria already exist in Europe?
Yes, yes. And the problem with those is, you know, malaria today remains one of the most deadly diseases. And so for those of us who travel widely, you know, there's always the challenge when I've traveled through parts of Africa that you understand that there are chloroquine-resistant areas. So even if you try to take a prophylaxis to protect you, the protection rates are very low. So you simply have to take a preventive stance. Mosquito netting, long sleeves, long pants at dusk and dawn. But yes, those kinds of deadly diseases remain tremendous challenges even today, but particularly malaria. Particularly malaria. Anything that is mosquito-borne is you know, the goal is to eradicate the mosquitoes rather than to deal with the diseases that they help to propagate. Well, here we see, I made mention earlier that technically Christopher Columbus was the second European to arrive along the coast. And here we have Rodrigo de Bastidas, a wealthy notary public from Sevilla, from Seville. He was the first of many Spaniards to reach the isthmus. It's said that he sailed westward from what is now Venezuela in 1501 in search of gold. And he explored a wide area of the Caribbean coast before heading to the Caribbean and West Indies. It would be as I said, on Columbus's fourth voyage, that he would actually touch several points on the isthmus, and one of those would be the horseshoe-shaped harbor that he named Puerto Bello, the beautiful port, and that was later renamed Portobello. So here we have Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who had been a member of Bastida's crew. He had settled in Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, but he stowed away on a voyage to Panama in 1510, ostensibly to escape his creditors. Should we all be so lucky to do that today, right? Just hop a ship and hope everything is forgotten and forgiven. But at that time, there were about 800 Spaniards living on the isthmus. But soon, the many jungle perils, doubtlessly including malaria and yellow fever, had killed all but 60 of them. A settlement was created at Antigua del Darien, Antigua, the first city to be duly constituted by the Spanish crown. And Balboa rose to a position of administrator. He insisted that the settlers begin to plant crops rather than depend solely on supply ships, and Antigua became a prosperous community. Like other conquistadors, Balboa led raids on indigenous settlements, but unlike most, he proceeded as best he could to fairly negotiate with some of the Native American peoples. In fact, he took the daughter of one of the key caciques, chiefs, as his lifelong mistress. On September 1st, 1513, Balboa set out with 190 Spaniards, among them Francisco Pizarro, who would later be the conqueror of the Inca Empire in Peru. So Balboa sets out with 190 Spaniards, a pack of attack dogs, and 1,000 Indian servants. After 25 days of hacking their way through the jungle, the party arrived at the vast expanse of the South Sea, which is now the Pacific Ocean. Balboa, the story goes, clad in full armor, waded into the water and claimed the sea and all the shores that it washed for his God and his king. Balboa returned to Antigua in January 1514 with his soldiers, with some cotton cloth, with some pearls, and with a small amount of gold. In his absence, Balboa's enemies, those who were jealous, others who sought to raise their own socioeconomic status, which was the goal of many of these Spaniards, to provide a family name, to raise their stature. And so there was tremendous infighting, particularly in a place like the Isthmus of Panama, where they hadn't come across a civilization such as that of the Mexica, the Aztecs, or the Inca, where there would be tremendous riches that could be subdivided. And so Balboa's enemies had in the interim denounced him to the Spanish court. And King Ferdinand appointed a new governor for the colony, which was being called at that time Castilla de Oro. This new governor was Pedro Arias de Avila. He became known as Pedrarias the Cruel, and he charged Balboa with treason. And so, to kind of tell you what happens, in 1517, Balboa was arrested. He was brought to the court of Pedrarias, found guilty, and executed. Balboa was beheaded. Pedrarias is Pedro Arias Davila, is really seen as, in some ways, the founder of the original Panama Viejo, the old city that would later be destroyed. And so this represents his role on the 15th of August, 1519, as founding this first major settlement that would become the core for Panama City proper. And here is a lithograph showing the public execution of the great Balboa. We would see on the Caribbean coast the founding of an early settlement, Nombre de Dios. It would serve as a Caribbean port for trans-Isthmian traffic. It would be here that the first Camino Real, the first royal road that would link Panama, this Panama of Pedrarias, with Nombre de Dios. And along this trail, traces of which can still be followed today, gold from Peru was carried by mule pack to Spanish galleons waiting on the Atlantic coast. The increasing importance of the isthmus for transporting treasure and the delay and difficulties posed by the Camino Real inspired surveys that were ordered by the Spanish crown in the 1520s and 1530s to ascertain the feasibility of more efficient travel. And through these studies, we have the first idea of a canal. And again, that would be put forward by this person here, the King of Spain, Charles I, who's also known as the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. This would be a super important period in Panamanian history. And let me make reference to Charles's rule. You know, he was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella.
I was going to ask,
yeah.
What was the motivation for Canal to get to the Pacific? Was there something going on over there that they wanted to get to?
Yeah, absolutely. So what was happening is the gold and later silver from places like Potosi were being shipped from destinations such as Lima on the Pacific coast, coming up to the Pacific coast of Panama. They would be offloaded there. They would cross the isthmus to the Atlantic or Caribbean side. And so there was this Camino Real, but they wanted something that could be even more secure, more efficient, and that would allow the flow to take place in a more logistically sound fashion. And so that led the Spanish crown, particularly Charles V, to send out teams to figure out what are our options, what can we possibly do. And that's when the idea was originally floated that maybe we could have a canal, that there could be a passage across this 50-mile wide isthmus. And that's really the first written recommendation that this might be an option. So yeah, the Pacific side, where there is now Panama City, was extremely important because of all the commodities moving from the New World back to Spain, the king was fixated on gold and silver. That was the liquid capital that kept the empire moving. In an age of bullionism, in an age where precious specie, gold and silver, enabled Spain to move men and materiel around the globe, those things were absolutely critical. And the Spanish crown, going again back to the Reconquista, one of the things that was organized in dividing the spoils, the early liege lords who would become kings would be given 20% of the most precious commodity. That became the quinto. And so that concept traveled from Iberia during that 780-plus year struggle to the Americas, and now the Spanish crown is saying they want the quinto, but in gold and silver. 20% off the top for the Spanish treasury. So this was hugely important. Unlike Ferdinand and Isabella, you know, Charles was a unique figure in that he's got two of the most powerful sets of grandparents you can possibly have. So he's got Ferdinand and Isabella, and it's from them that he inherits the dominions in Iberia. But it would be from his paternal grandparents that he would inherit all of the Habsburg territories. He would have lands in the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium. He would have areas in the German-speaking territories, what is now Germany proper, stretching into parts of Eastern Europe. He had territories in Spain. He had islands in the Mediterranean, footholds in North Africa. This is the most heterogeneous empire, and it was all held together by him. That's the only glue that held it all together. At the same time, his dominions in the Americas are expanding. And one of the places that he was focused on was Panama. He saw this as a critical transit point, that this would be the place that would keep him, and he was an itinerant ruler. You know, he, in all of his years, when he finally abdicated voluntarily and stepped down, he said, "My life's been one long journey." And many of the Spaniards looked askance. He had been born in the Low Countries. When he arrived in Spain, he couldn't speak Castilian. Spoke French, spoke Flemish, but he realized that Spain was his most important kingdom. And so of all the places that he controlled, he lived there the longest, some 12 years. But he lived long periods in the Netherlands, when there was a recalcitrant priest by the name of Martin Luther causing a Protestant heresy in his mind in the German-speaking territories. He went there to deal with that, so he was constantly on the move. But he's an important figure, and he's an important figure because if you study also the history of the indigenous peoples, it's under Charles that some public debate is carried forth to determine exactly how should Native Americans be considered within the imperial structure. And so, to that end, we have the famous Dominican friar, Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas is known as the protector of the Indians. That's the moniker he's been given. And he writes an important work known as the Destruction of the Indies, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And in it, he speaks to the atrocities, to the exploitation that he witnessed Spaniards committing throughout various parts of the New World. And he did it to document for Charles that this had to stop. The argument was that Spain had become an expansionist colonial power, not to exploit, not to enrich itself, but first and foremost to extend Christendom. Charles took that very seriously. And so Spain decided, in essence, the court of Charles decided to debate this issue. What is our purpose? What are we seeking to achieve? What role within the colonies should Native Americans play? And so there was this debate of sorts between Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued that Native Americans were rational beings, that Native Americans should be protected by the Spanish crown. Unfortunately, that would evidence itself in kind of a gross paternalistic manner. But the reality was that Bartolomé de las Casas was concerned that if the Native Americans were exploited, that if they were in fact then exterminated, the entire colonial experiment would fail, and that it was incumbent upon Charles to step in and do something about it. On the other side of the debate was an Aristotelian philosopher by the name of Ginés de Sepúlveda, and he argued that, as Aristotle had suggested, there are certain people who by right should be subjugated and made to provide labor and tribute for others. When it was over, Charles sided with Bartolomé de las Casas. And in 1542, the new laws of the Indies were put forward, stating that the way labor was organized in the Americas had to change, that Spaniards could no longer exploit Native Americans in the way that these early conquistadores had. Now, did that change overnight? Of course not. One of the greatest challenges that the Spanish crown would have throughout its many centuries of control in the Americas, the two great enemies were space and time. And when you think about it, this is the first empire in all of human history where the metropole, the mother country, is separated from the colonies by a vast ocean. Never before had that been attempted. Think about all the other great empires in antiquity. They were all contiguous land masses, not this. And so Charles had to figure out, how do I keep people loyal? How do I make sure that those who are agents of the crown are actually doing my bidding? And that, one of the ways, was to take from them this labor pool and place Native Americans under the dominion of the Spanish crown. I did want to mention that the regulations for colonial administration set by Charles V's Council of the Indies decreed that Native Americans were to be protected, but that they also were to be converted or proselytized to Christianity. The colonies were far from the seat of ultimate responsibility, and few administrators were guided by really a humane spirit. But the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly the Franciscan order, showed concern for the welfare of Native Americans on the Panamanian Isthmus. But church efforts alone were inadequate to the situation. While Native Americans found one effective benefactor among their Spanish oppressors, Bartolomé de las Casas was unable to defend them in the way that he had hoped. He made one suggestion that he later regretted. Bartolomé de las Casas lived a long life. And as protector of the Indians, he made a suggestion that their labor could be replaced by the labor of African slaves. He would later ask forgiveness for that, but there are many who still point to the fact that this individual, who was quick to defend Native Americans, at the same time placed Africans in a condition of coerced servitude. In 1517, Charles V granted a concession for exporting 4,000 African slaves to the Antilles. And so the slave trade begins in earnest for Spain. Panama would be a major distribution point for slaves headed elsewhere on the mainland. The supply of Native American labor had been depleted by the mid-16th century, and Panama, as such, began to absorb many of the African slaves. A large number of those original arrivals escaped. They, on occasion, in a subsistence fashion, would attack travelers along the Camino Real. I looked in the archives to see that an official census of Panama City in 1610 listed 548 citizens, 303 women, 156 children, 146 mulattoes, 148 people from the Antilles who were listed as of African descent, and 3,500 African slaves. My point is that Panama, from the beginning, had a much larger percentage. The vast majority of those were African-descended peoples. Just very quickly. Panama would be a key player, either as a transit point or a receiver of African slaves. The Atlantic slave trade basically would take place over a 400-year, 350-year period. This references the high point, which begins roughly around 1650. 1650 is when sugar production takes off. The exact date is new technologies were brought to Barbados in 1652, and that leads to the sugar boom. Sugar required large numbers of laborers to cut the cane, to have the cut cane processed. And so you see these vectors showing where slaves were being brought from, where they were headed to. One thing about the Atlantic slave trade, very briefly, is that it is fluid. It changes over time. It's not a snapshot. If you're talking about the Atlantic slave trade in the 1500s, it is something very different from the 1700s, which again is very different from the 1800s. The century that saw the largest number of Africans transshipped across the Atlantic was the 1700s, the 18th century. By far. Most slaves in every century entered the gateway of Brazil. 42% of all Africans ever brought to the Americas entered Brazil. Brazil was the primary gateway. And what many people find astounding is that today Brazil has more people of African descent than any country in Africa, with the exception of Nigeria. That is the powerful way in which the Atlantic African slave trade has shaped the Americas. The second main gateway for slaves into the Americas was the Caribbean. Spanish Caribbean, but also the Anglophone, the English Caribbean, as well as the French Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the place that would have the largest number of slaves by the end of the 18th century was Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti. There were at least 500,000, perhaps as many as 600,000 African slaves in an area the size of the state of Maryland. Tiny. The French also had Martinique and Guadeloupe. The second major sugar-producing region, with the second largest African slave population in the Caribbean, was English-controlled Jamaica. Okay? The third main gateway, numerically, would be the coastal areas of Tierra Firma, the Spanish mainland. And so we see some early arrivals to Veracruz in Mexico, but later on, far more who would be brought to Cartagena, the north coast of Colombia, to Panama. Some stayed in Panama. Some then, as you can see, were brought across Panama to the Pacific coast, to Lima, to Ecuador as well. And the final gateway would be what's now the southern United States, the southern colonies that become the southern United States. The numbers there were far less. The number of slaves brought to the Carolinas and Virginia never, in any century, rivaled that of the numbers that were brought to Brazil or to the Caribbean. Panama, again, is the main conduit for the flow of African slaves to various parts of coastal Spanish America. You can see the various commodities produced: cotton, coffee, tobacco, some mining, but less. That tended to be, Native Americans were utilized more for the mining. But by far, the most significant was sugar, which meant that a place like Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, would be considered by the French as the most valuable real estate per square mile on the face of the earth in the 1780s. It produced 40% of the sugar and 40% of the coffee consumed in North America and in Europe. It was France's most lucrative colony. In fact, after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, with the British having emerged victorious, there was an attempt on the part of the British to decide which territories that it had captured it was going to keep. And it was kind of, should we take this frozen tundra known as Canada, or should we take Martinique and Guadeloupe? And there was actually serious debate in Parliament. They nearly went with those sugar islands. Later on, they decided, well, you know, it'll provide a bit of a buffer for our 13 colonies in North America. We'll be able to root the French out of Canada. They won't any longer be the kind of threat that they were if we take control of Canada. And so that's the route that they took. But that's how valuable that Caribbean real estate happened to be. Was there a question? Yes?
Going back just a step.
Yep.
Was there a hierarchy between Spanish citizens, indigenous citizens, and slaves?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, in administering the colonies, you see here that initially Spain has just two viceroyalties, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and it stops right at Panama, and then the Viceroyalty of Peru, which included Panama, what is now Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. Later on, this will be subdivided. You'll have a viceroyalty in the northern tier of South America, that would be New Granada, and then the viceroyalty of La Plata, which would include present-day Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, along with Bolivia, which was pulled off. So there was a strict hierarchy within the society. There were, at the very top, the Spaniards who were born in Spain, the Peninsulares. They had the best access to high positions. They were given deference by all others. There then were the Spaniards born in the Americas, known as the Creoles, the Criollos. They were fully European, but not considered of the same high socioeconomic level of the Spanish-born or Iberian-born Spaniards. You then, over time, would quickly have a middle sector made up of mixed-race peoples called the castas. Some would be part European and part indigenous. They would be the mestizos. Some would be part European and part African, mulatos. And then you would have the Native Americans and African-descended peoples. And that's basically what the social structure looked like. And it was indeed, in a sense, a pyramid structure in terms of how it's represented numerically. Just to reiterate, and I showed this in our first session, but again, look at Panama. Panama is the place over which everything is moving. It is the nerve center for supplies to the Pacific areas that Spain controlled, the very important Viceroyalty of Peru. So you see these goods moving from Peru to the Pacific side of Panama, across the Isthmus to Portobello, and then for transshipment in a numerous different possible ways. This just shows back and forth to Cartagena, but also directly to Havana and to other destinations as well. You've got as the need by the Spanish to completely fortify these choke points. So Veracruz, Portobello, Santo Domingo, Havana, Cartagena, all of them over time were heavily fortified to protect against incursions by pirates, buccaneers, the freebooters, and of course, the most infamous of those was Francis Drake. There is barely a major city in the Caribbean or along the Caribbean coast of Central America that doesn't have some plaque or mention to El Drake. He was considered by the Spanish, and the actual terminology really stood out. Back in these times, he was referred to as a terrorist. And of course, he was responsible for the capture of a Spanish fleet on the Pacific side. He offloads the riches onto his ships, completes the circumnavigation of the globe, arrives in London, and is knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. Question at the very top. Yes?
Yes, I wanted you to give a more extensive, first of all, I want to thank you for the thoughtful presentation.
Sure.
You were talking about the war between the Iberians and the Muslims.
Yes.
So I'd like for you to give a more detailed profile. Who were these Iberians? The Christians, right?
Right.
And then the Muslims, were they the Moors?
Yes. So they're also
And then the other thing that's kind of connected to this is the Christians. This Santiago was their God. I mean, was God.
Santiago. No, St. James. He is the disciple of Christ.
Okay, so who was the killer of the...
They would call upon Santiago for protection, for...
Santiago's like Saint.
Yep, exactly. So you are channeling divine intervention through the saints, and in this case through St. James. And there is in Spain, you know, in the northern part, in Compostela, you can do the Camino, you can do the pilgrimage, and kind of walk to see the holy relics of St. James in Santiago de Compostela. It's the same medieval route that pilgrims took going back many, many centuries. The Christians that I referenced were the peoples of the old Roman Empire in the West. Spain had been a part of Rome's empire there, and so you had a mix of various groups. And after the reign of the Emperor Constantine, there's an effort to Christianize parts of the Roman Empire. And so parts of Spain, these western outposts, do become at least nominally Christian. And so, so you have those groups, but it's still a medieval society, lords and vassals, reciprocal responsibilities and rights, land exchanged for military service. And that's what is also helping to bring about these changing alliances of these militaristic orders. And then, after 1085, you have an influx of warrior monks coming from the German-speaking areas, coming from France, Cluny, coming from Italy to fight in this struggle. Yes?
You talk about the slave trade starting in like 1650, and I'm curious.
Oh, much earlier. Yeah. But I mean, the real takeoff with sugar, where you see new sugar technologies employed, and so the numbers ramp up considerably is 1650. Yes?
So my question was use of slaves endemic within the society to run their countries and their cities, or was it they viewed slaves was already being used and just expanded, or did the New World really invent the need for slavery and the huge amount of slaves that were imported?
No, Native Americans were utilized for labor and tribute in very hierarchical structures, more complex societies amongst, say, for instance, the Mexica, the Aztecs, amongst the Inca. And so, yeah, but they weren't, in a sense, considered property. Even in the Spanish world, you have to be careful with this, slaves weren't property in the way that they were in the British or the French or the Dutch world. They had rights. They could take the sacraments of the church. There are petitions and grievances that groups of Africans actually sent back to the crown in Spain. The goal of the Spanish crown was always to maintain social order. So there were times where Native American villages, slaves on a particular hacienda or on a plantation would write the king. And the king would take steps to end whatever abuses were occurring. Maybe not out of humanitarian considerations, but because they didn't want to see these slaves rise up and create a rebellion. And so social order was at the forefront of the crown's calculations, always. And so because of that, we see steps taken where there are particularly abusive encomenderos, where there are hacenderos who are creating a situation where there are complaints and either the Native American population or the African slave population is sufficiently upset that they go to a parish priest and have a letter of grievance sent. The kings, if enough of that started coming back, took action. Absolutely. Okay, so to kind of bring things to a close, so I made reference to the Camino Real, and you can still see portions of it here. Again, here's the famous Panama Viejo. I showed you the most famous sea dog, who was Sir Francis Drake. You also have Henry Morgan's attack on Panama, and I've actually got some of the facts and figures and kind of a report that the Spanish put together that was based on eyewitness accounts that I'll save for our next session. And I'll talk about this raid in 1671, and then just kind of jump quickly into, so how does independence come about? For Panama, it's more circuitous than it would be in the northern tier of South America or the southern cone or for Mexico. But just with, we're looking today at just the heart of the colonial period, the Spanish colonial period in the Americas and in Panama. So I've got just a minute or two left, but let me answer any questions that you might have on just some of the things that we looked at. Yes, please.
Reflecting on your slide a while back,
Yeah.
on the slave trade from Western Africa, should we assume that most of that slave trade was carried on Spanish bottoms?
No, not at all. Excellent question. The Spanish tended to rely on third parties to bring slaves to the Americas for them. Early on, it was the Portuguese. Later, it would be the French and the Dutch. And during the 1700s, it would be the British.
So when they got to the Caribbean, when the African slaves got to the Caribbean, to get to the United States, wasn't that part of the British Triangle trade?
It was.
And Americans. So that was, As far as those that got to the United States, they were largely bought by British and American
Yes,
ships.
exactly.
Later days.
But there would be some brought to the Caribbean for a process known as seasoning, where these African slaves who had been captured as prisoners of war in these internecine wars in Africa would be marched from the interior to the coast, traded by coastal African states to Europeans on the coast, transshipped, and in some cases brought to the Caribbean, where they would be introduced to the rigorous work regimen that was American plantation slavery. Yes, please.
Have visited the Bell Fisher Museum down along the coast above Vero Beach, and they tell the story there. This is kind of a facts checker. They tell the story that the king of Spain wanted to marry a French woman, and he told his people in America, South America, to get as many, like $5 million worth of treasure on ships that hit hurricanes around that area there. And like 3 times he attempted to get his reverse dowry, you say, shipped to him. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know the specifics of the amount, but I can tell you around that area of Vero Beach and all, there are those shipwrecks that went down with Spanish treasures. And one of the places that has led the charge to try to identify those and to process it is the University of Florida. So they've done a lot of work in looking at ship registries, trying to figure out where those galleons, where those fleets happen to be when they hit things like hurricanes and inclement weather of sorts. So there is something to it. The specifics, though, I'm not really sure. Yes?
Sort of a timeline question.
Yes.
Around 1517 or thereabouts, we had a substantial native population in Panama. How long did it take before the native population really became decimated or incidental?
It's usually, ethnographers have said it's usually within the first 4 decades. So the first 40 years, you see a really precipitous decline. In a larger sense, there's been an argument that in Mesoamerica, stretching down, not including Panama, but what is now Mexico into parts of Central America, that there was a Native American population somewhere around 20 to 22 million at the moment of encounter. And that by the first decade of the 1600s, there was less than 1 million. So that gives a sense of the catastrophic population decline. Now, that was in the course of a century. But even so, in the final stages of the siege of Tenochtitlan, when the Spaniards were taking the Aztec capital, what enabled them to do it as efficiently and effectively was a smallpox outbreak, precisely at the moment that Cortés was laying siege to that capital. So in some cases, the actual death and destruction happens rather quickly. One of the things that enabled Francisco Pizarro to be so wildly successful with so few Spaniards in the Inca world was that measles and smallpox had arrived and actually killed the Inca emperor Huayna Capac even before the Spaniards arrived. So when the Spaniards arrive in the 1530s, in the Inca world, you've got 2 half-brothers who are having a civil war against each other. Atahualpa and his half-brother were fighting for control. How convenient. The Spaniards arrive, you've got a civil war, you've got, death and the decimation of the population. So that's a key component of it. So just some major things, some of the important things that we've covered. We looked really at the heart of the colonial issue. I will be able to move us then in our next session quickly into the 19th century and beyond. That's where we actually will start with things like the Panama Railroad, the French Canal project, and then how Panama itself becomes an independent entity ready for the U.S. Canal. And so I'm sure most of you are interested in the canal, so that's what we'll do. I'll see you next week.